So I turn to English now because the seminar, the webinar is in English. I first would like to thank very much Marie-Estelle Binet and all the research team here at Sciences Po Grenoble for inviting us over. For very unfortunate reasons, I will be the only one presenting today. So my name is Simon Persico and I'm a professor in political science here at Sciences Po Grenoble and at the Pacte laboratory. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a paper and more a research project that has been written by three of us. So there is Florent Gougou, who can't be here today because of illness reasons, and also Chloé Alexandre, who is a PhD student here at Sciences Po as well, and who worked with us on that project. Let me start by sharing a short presentation that I have. We have 30 minutes together for me to present this project and to let you go through it. Sorry, yeah. I hope this works for everybody, even though I don't have feedback. I will put it full screen as well. So, yeah. Okay. So I hope this works. So the paper, the research project I'm going to present today is about what unites and divides the environmental movement, ideological consensus and conflict amongst French climate activists. This is a paper that is part of a more general research project, which I'm going to talk about, which intends at studying the supporters, members, activists in the climate change movement in France. The outline of the presentation will be the following. First, I'll start by outlining the starting point and the objectives of this article and the more general research project. Then I'll turn to data and methods to focus a little bit on how we decided to survey the climate movement through an internet-based survey of climate change supporters and activists. And then I'll go very classically to findings and discussion of the paper, more focused on the paper than the research project in general. So as for starting points and objectives, so this is part of a research project that is kind of new to both Florent Gougou, Chloé Alexandre, and I. We had different research backgrounds coming into that project. Florent and I worked on green voters and green parties, the fate in green parties, and the way environmental political issues were politicized in party competition. We also studied the role of multiple environmental related issues in political competition. So by claiming that there is no one single valence issue, as it is often assumed in the literature. And there is also here at Pacte, we're kind of new researchers into the field of environmental activists and environmental in brackets, because there is kind of a tradition that had been initiated quite recently, 3 years ago, by Tristan Guerra, Chloé Alexandre, Frédéric Gontier, Florent, and I on the Yellow Vest movement. So that was the intention of many of us to understand what was happening regarding the Yellow Vest as these movements happened. Okay, so we ran, thanks to Tristan and Chloé, a survey, an online survey on Yellow Vest activists and supporters, which we published results from in many publications and still working on. But the idea is that we wanted to replicate that kind of survey on the supporters of the climate movement, because obviously those two movements, the Yellow Vest, Gilets jaunes, and the climate movement happened quite at the same time. They didn't have the same repertoire d'action, the same tools for mobilizing, and they didn't really convince the same type of people to join as well. But we didn't know much, and we wanted to know more about who were participating and also what their values, what their preferences in terms of political participation, political engagement were. Basically, that was the fact that something was happening and we needed to understand. We wanted to understand something in the making, a social movement in the making. Because obviously, when a movement is over, then it's kind of too late to go back and have access to a great number of people that participated in one form or another to the movement. So what's the overview of the research project? We had two initial research questions. First, that's a who question. Who were the French people involved in the climate movement? So the first task the research project had was to describe the population that was the most interested and politicized on the environmental issue. And a second, maybe secondary dimension of the project was to assess the unity or diversity of these supporters of the climate change movement. So how united or divided are these people in terms of environmental related values? Because obviously we know that they are aware of the environmental challenge, that they are focused on it, politicized, they are favorable to the movement, but how do these citizens perceive what an eco-friendly society should look like? How do they connect the environmental priority that they have, if they are close to the movement, with their preferences in terms of other issues, such as the economy, immigration, democracy, or many other issues? To sum up in one single question, the question we wanted to ask was, what values define the environmental movement and what ideological conflicts divide the citizens within it? So that's the question more precise about the paper that I'm going to talk about today. We're really focusing on this single group of people, this kind of green class, if you want, or kind of the green community that we try to measure and pick up as precisely as possible, thanks to our survey, and to assess the degree of unity and diversity of this movement. Because obviously, if you take this community in a more general spectrum, they have many things in common. The first thing they have in common is that they are very much focused and very much enthusiastic about environmental policy. But what divides them is a very important question as well. And that's what we try to answer. So the theoretical framework of the paper is to try and recollect the main debates that have cut across the environmental movement from an elite standpoint. Okay, so we know that in his history, the environmental movement has witnessed the existence of many specific issues and specific conflict that we wanted to recollect. The first is between collapsology and eco-optimism. This pits people that believe that basically the times are over and that the climate crisis is so serious that the Western civilizations are going to collapse. You find that in, for example, Dalton's work or other people in France, for example, when you think about collapsology effondriste, what we call the authors that kind of claim for a radical effondrement, collapse of our civilization. But there are another option to that debate, which is what we call eco-optimism, which basically claims that things are going to be okay for humanity and that humanity will be able to face the crisis that it witnesses right now. The second debate that has kind of cut across the climate movement and the environmental movement more generally is the question of degrowth, of what do we do with economic growth, the growth in GDP. And there is a strong debate between those that advocate for a green growth, so carry on with increasing wealth and increasing productivity gains, versus those who claim that basically the idea of economic growth in itself is a problem, and that we need to democratically choose a path away from economic growth to focus on other type of indicators or of well-being or natural respects and all that kind of alternative indicators of well-being, and to go away from economic growth. The third debate that we recollected, and that's also very important and vivid in the environmental movement, even though in France it's mostly dominated by the democratic environmentalists, but is a debate between democracy and authoritarianism. And here it's all the question that was asked by Hans Jonas in the 1980s about whether democracies are the best able to face the environmental crisis and to take the necessary decisions. Okay, and the argument made by Jonas is that we should maybe have kind of a tyranny of a well-benevolent elite that will act in the public interest in terms of environmental matters. But in the environmental movement, there is also a very strong tradition of, I would say, radical democracy decision-making. Environmentalists for long have claimed that participatory democracy, even direct democracy are interesting tools to face the environmental crisis and to take the good decisions. The fourth debate that we focused on is between Neo-Malthusianism and Egalitarianism. So this is about basically the idea that the main problem is not very much growth or even pollution, it's overpopulation. Okay, it's an argument that's been made in books in the 1970s, such as The Human Bomb by the Ehrlichs. And opposed to that idea are those that we claim are egalitarian, that basically say that one life in Nigeria, for example, is worth nothing compared to in terms of carbon footprints, and that the problem is not overpopulation, but the distribution of resources. Another debate that we focused upon is very maybe it's the more recent of all debates that we reflected upon. It's the idea of the environmental problems being strongly and intimately connected to colonialism and patriarchism. Okay, so we all know the kind of wokist argument of anti-discrimination policies and anti-discrimination, the fight against colonialism, the fight against racism or against patriarchism. And it's clear that it has been very strong within the environmental movement. When you look at the current literature, it very often connects those discrimination, racism or anti-poor discrimination to, or anti-women discrimination, to the environmental crisis. This is true in the eco-feminist movement, but it's also true in the post-colonial. And we make the argument that these kind of ways of framing the environment as linked to other forms of domination is common, but there is clear opponents to that. There within the environmental movement, there are people that say, no, these are no relations, and we should keep on with the traditional Western values as far as racism or discriminations are concerned. And another debate that we again recollected, which we thought was very interesting to capture when looking at these questions, is the technophobia versus techno-optimism debate. Okay, it's clear that within the environmental movement, there are those that trust technological changes and for example, nuclear power production, versus those that are really critical against technology in the first place, saying that human beings are becoming more and more dependent vis-à-vis technological changes, and that we need to be more, to get free from these. And the idea for us is to explore inductively if and how these debates have infused in the demand side, okay? And starting by the supporters of the climate movement, okay? How do the climate supporters of the climate movement, which we assume are clearly environmentalists in a very general sense of the term, how do they relate to this debate on collapsology, on degrowth, on democracy versus authoritarianism, on post-colonial ecofeminism, on technophobia, etc., etc. Okay, we wanted to make a clear, to have inductively, so starting from general questions, and to assess how these debates were taking place within the movement. To do so, and I turn to the way we decided to survey the movement, we used an ad hoc survey methodology, which was used already in the Yellow Vest movements, I talked about already, since 2008. We call a socially mediated internet survey. So we use national and local Facebook groups. We did that for the Yellow Vest. We did that also for the climate movement. And the Yellow Vest movement had a survey had quite a success with 6,000 respondents. And there are many works by Tristan, Chloé, Frédéric, and Stéphanie that you can read, obviously, on the Yellow Vest. As for the climate movement, we decided to replicate this type of methodology to focus and to assess this population of supporters of the climate movement. And we here see different shades of green, in a sense, depending on how intense is the citizens' engagement towards the environment. Okay, so we decided to go on the groups of climate marches and all the groups that were on Facebook clearly participating to the climate movement. We also contacted specific NGOs and associations that were engaged in the climate movement to help diffuse the call for participation to our survey, using associations like On est prêt, or the groups of the Convention citoyenne pour le climat, Alternativa, Friends of the Earth, and many organizations that helped us kind of reach out to the supporters of the climate movement. And hence, it led us to many answers that we, so here is another other examples of groups that we targeted on Facebook. Tous unis avec Nicolas Hulot, for example, but also people that want to vivre bio, so live in an organic fashion, and many types of groups that have a different connection to the environmental movement. So some are very politicized, some are more about ways of living in the everyday life. So many different dimensions. Okay, so we reached out to these very different groups and citizens, and the questions we asked were based on 7 different blocks of questions, if you wish. One on social and demographic characteristics, who are they? Some on individual practices and action regarding the environment. Some on the relation to the climate movement. Some questions were focused on the general political preferences. Who do you vote for? How do you position yourself on the left-right divide, etc., etc. And also questions on non-environmental values, on immigration, on the economy, on inequality, on the way the democracy works, and so on. And finally, we also ask questions on the political preferences and behavior related to ecologism and on environmental values. Here, we asked many questions on collapsology, technophobia, Malthusianism, and all the cleavages, the debates, the conflicts that I was talking about previously. We managed to get 10,000 answers in some more or less 20 weeks. which we were really happy. Of this, almost 9,000 individuals completed the questionnaire in full. That's an 87% fill out rate. And it is clear that we had some bias which are no surprise, because obviously the population is different from the French population, but it's skewed in the way that there are many more respondents that were educated. So the level of a diploma was higher than the French general population. And secondly, and that was more of a surprise because it was a very different result from the yellow vest survey that we did with the exact same method. So that means that the difference is significant between the two movements. We found very high number of young people, even people that were younger than 18 years old, so not minor, as we say in France, we don't have the right to vote. There were a very young respondent population, which was kind of a surprise, or actually a strong result. It didn't surprise it that much because we know, for having looked at who participate to the climate marches, etc., that the young population is part of the driver. These are young this is a young generations movement, if we wish. But it was clear by the data. We were also quite reassured about the quality of our data by seeing that the maps of the answers kind of matched the strength and weaknesses of the environmental movement when we take other indicators. For example, here you have the distribution of respondents on the left, you have the distribution of respondents population in the department, with and on the right you have the vote for ELV, so the Green Party, in the last European elections. And you clearly see that where the Greens are the strongest, this is also where we had the highest number of respondents to our survey. So there are many validating points that come from comparing our data to other type of data that we can gather on the strength and weaknesses of the environmental movement. If you're interested, we wrote a first report on the survey on HAL SHS. So you type Gougou, Guerra, Persico. It's called the Rapport d'études Grande Enquête Mouvement Climat, where you find all the data and all the details as far as the methodology is concerned. Just a quick look at the divergence. So you clearly see that our sample is very young. This is in the middle graph here. That it is very the level of education is higher than compared to the French general population. The bars are in gray, or to the yellow vest movement. The bars are in yellow. In terms of distribution, spatial distribution, we see that we have more respondents coming from the cities, big cities. Again, that's not that much of a surprise when we know the movement. But we also have to realize that there are some people that are supporters of the climate movement and that come from the countryside or from very small towns. And as far as the social origins, we also see that people that are cadres, managers, professions intermédiaires, intermediate professions, compose a high number of our sample. In terms of income, it's also skewed a little bit, not as much as commentators could have thought, however. And I'm gonna go now to the methods that we used, because here I presented the main results and the main description of our sample. But now remember, the question we asked was what unites and divides the movement in terms of its environmental values. And to answer this question, we used a type of geometric data analysis for categorical variable. There are many people in political science that know that because Bourdieu, for example, used this type of methods. We had 23 active variables. So we tried to use these. These were the questions related to the theoretical or ideological debates I was talking about. And we also, so this creates the geometric analysis. Okay, it tries to represent the space of values by increasing the variance within the. It's kind of a complicated statistical analysis to explain just like that in a webinar, but basically it allows to have the space of values. And we also have what we call supplementary variables, which are more descriptive and which allow us to present the socio-demographic and socio-political dimensions as well. So the space in itself is constructed by the value space. So the answers people gave on questions about technophobia or collapsology or growth. And we could also analyze how they worked. So again, the conflicts and active variables are these one. I won't list them all, but you can read them if you want. We had 3 questions on collapsology versus eco-optimism. We had 3 questions on degrowth versus productivism. We had 3 questions on democracy versus authoritarianism. We had 2 questions on ecocentrism versus anthropocentrism. We had 4 questions on individual responsibility versus governmental action. Okay, is it necessary so for example, the question is, there is no point in doing what I can for the environment if others don't do the same. Do you agree or don't you agree? We had 2 questions on Neo-Malthusianism versus egalitarianism. And we had 4 questions on post-colonial ecofeminism versus traditional Western values. And finally, sorry for being a little long, we had 2 questions on technophobia versus techno-modernism. So that's almost 30 questions altogether. And that allows us to plot where the people that answered differently to these different questions can be positioned on a single space. Okay. How to simplify the relationship between those positions on the space. And here are our main results. It takes a little time to explain, and at least it takes a little time for you to kind of read to understand what we mean. So to explain this type of analysis, we need to remember that basically the first axis is what explains the more of the variances in our sample. And when we look at this first axis, we see that it's composed about 3 different issues, different conflicts that I was talking about. Okay. But before I get into that, there is a reminder that we should all have in mind. It's the fact that those supporters of the climate movement share a very high level of consensus on most of our environmental issues. So when we compare the people that have participated to the survey to the French general population, it's clear that they look very much alike compared to the other French citizens. Okay, they are very, very much politicized on environmental issues. That they share somewhat the same opinion, but there is divergence within that sample. Okay, so it depends. If you compare it to the French population, it looks very similar. If you focus on that sample, you see divisions. And these are the divisions I'm trying to explain right now. So the first result we found is that most of the differences between these respondents is on the first axis. Okay, so most of their differences can be represented on the horizontal axis, which pits people that are quite productivist or that defend the Western way of life. That's WWL here that you see in the graph, or that are not at all collapsologists, that are rather eco-optimists, or that trust technophilia. They seem to look very much alike. And at the other end of the axis, we look people that are very critical against productivism, people that are critical against the Western way of life and that are rather post-colonial ecofeminist. We found people that are very much critical against technology. Okay, so that's the major opposition dimension. We called it dark greens against light greens. Okay, as for simplification, because in a way it means that most of the issues that clearly relate on the environment and on many dimensions of the environment, whether it be its connection to traditional values or to the economy or to the degree of optimism or technology. Okay, so these are dark greens versus light greens. So dark greens are radical on degrowth, technophobic, strongly opposed to the traditional sexist colonialist Western values. And light greens are eco-modernist, pro-growth, and attached to traditional Western values. And second, we found a second axis, the axis 2 that the statistical results gave us is not interesting, but I can go into much detail, but it would take too long. So, but the other axis that's interesting to study is axis 3, which is secondary in terms of how much variance it explains, but basically it pits authoritarian supporters of the climate movement that are more in favor of birth control, so Neo-Malthusian, state action, expert decision-making, versus libertarians that claim for more democratic solutions, for freedom of procreation, etc., etc. So the first is against light greens and dark greens, and the second dimension is pits authoritarian supporters to more libertarian ones. Here on this graph, we try to pit the supplementary variables. And what we see is that the main variable that explains the differences on the dark green versus light green is the degree of pessimism. So the more pessimists are on the dark green side versus, and the more optimists are on the light green side. Apart from that, there is very little difference in terms of diploma, education, age, type of living, whether it's in a city or in a town or in the countryside. It's also very slightly explained by the type of job that you have. So the first axis, everybody's kind of a mix. There is no real socio-demographic explanations for that. There is more of an explanation for the authoritarian versus libertarian axis, the vertical one, where the diploma explains the position. The more you're educated, the more you fit on the libertarian democratic side. And the less educated, the more you're authoritarian. This is no real surprise either. So the dark greens are more pessimistic people, working class, and the less educated are the less urban and the more authoritarian. And now we looked at the impact of socio-political, more political preferences that are not connected to the environment. And what we see is that most of the political variables explain both axis, both the dark versus light and the libertarian versus authoritarian. So political groups are at the crosscut of the two dimensions in a very linear manner. So libertarian dark greens are the more left-wing, the more activist, and authoritarian light greens are the more neutral or right-wing and the less politicized. And there is almost no political groups that's representative of authoritarian dark greens. And there is no real libertarian light greens either. So that's it for the main results. just a few ideas about how we could go further. The first would be to address oppositions in terms of methods in addition to values, because our questionnaire comprises item about the best way to carry demands and influence decision maker. But we could apply the same method to a more general sample, and also to compare population. We could focus on, for example, the voters of the Green parties or the members of the Green Party to that more general supporters population, which in a sense is a kind of a fuzzy socio-demographic category, but it's what we could do. And also especially replicate the questionnaire on a representative sample of the French population, all of those that are That's it for how we could go further, and we will, because we're really passionate about that topic. I thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye. So just a few answers to Fred's questions that I've just seen. I don't know when you put them up online. So he says, it is common knowledge in political science that the most sophisticated citizens are more likely to mirror elite frames. This is absolutely true. Seems like you found that those highly politicized demonstrators are more prone to organize their view in tune with cross-cutting debates among the environmental movement. Could you elaborate a little more on that? Yes, yeah, well, I could elaborate, but I mostly agree with you, is that in the fact that it's true that these are people that are more connected to the actual debates and that know what the issues that are at stake in the environmental movement, are able to position themselves on that. But in terms of elites, is more debatable, because basically elites are divided on that subject. Elites within the environmental movement, I mean. When you look at what happened in the climate change, in climate marches, for example, or the other climate movements, you find people that are very technophile, very optimistic and want to use green growth, etc., etc. And you found other elites that are way more radical. So it leaves room for those people that are obviously more educated and more sophisticated to have different positions. And we do find different positions, even if we were very amazed by the fact that the radical greens form the greater part of the movement. And second question, how much variance do your first and third axis explain? If I remember correctly, that's almost 40% for the first axis and almost 10% for the third axis. So a very strong difference indeed. And the first axis, the light versus green, light versus dark green dimension, explains most of the variance. Yeah, exactly. So Fred says, a nice finding in that demonstrators seems to prioritize GAL over TAN. Well, what we say is that, so for the viewers that don't know what GAL TAN means, it's a very famous kind of a way of explaining the divisions within the political system between green alternative libertarian, so the left, versus TAN, traditional authoritarian and nationalist. And this is very true, even though in a sense, what we also show is that it's mostly green and libertarian versus authoritarian, and so it's more green. The first axis is really about green and libertarian or alternative, and the second axis is more about democracy and authoritarian. So it's kind of different. And also our assumption is that it's it's also connected to the classical economical left-right divide. What we see is that the more you are on the left on issues such as redistribution of wealth or fight against inequality and stuff like that, and the more radical green you are. No, I wouldn't say that. Would you say that axis 1 boils down to post-materialism? I wouldn't say that, because obviously axis 2 is also about post-materialism. So I would say that axis 1 is a mix between post-materialism and the classical economical left-right divide. And I would say that axis 2 is about one specific dimension of the post-materialism divide, which is about self-expression, participatory democracy versus authoritarian institutions, and a very strong role for the state. All right, if there are no other questions, I thank you very much all for being here and your participation. Don't hesitate to get back to us, to Florent, to Chloé, or to me by email. You should find our emails quite easily on the Sciences Po or Pacte website. And I say bye-bye.